Well, hello, and welcome to Money Matters in Sports. I'm really looking forward to this panel today. We had a great one last year with your colleague Colin, and it's amazing to see what's happened in the last year. So, again, as you said, my name is Loron Orris. I'm the co-founding partner of Asia Sports Tech, where we are a strategic consulting and financial advisory firm. And so I'm really looking forward to having Deborah here. She's been 30 years in investment banking, 15 years as a co-founder and a partner in the Raine Group. And I have to tell you, in our previous discussion, we were talking about the various deals that she's put together over the years, and I can assure you that pretty much all the big deals that were happening in China and in parts of Asia were done by Deborah and her team, and truly amazing, including a few companies I worked with, including IMAX and the NBA. So great to have you, and welcome to
Thank you.
All That Matters, Deborah. Okay, so let's set the stage today. So one of the key things, if you think about it, every day we seem to be hearing about some new massive team valuation. We also hear about all these different developments taking place in the sports industry, a new league developing. And ultimately, what's driving this is eyeballs and media. And yet at the same time, it's a really big transitional time in the sports industry for a variety of reasons. Leagues, teams have made it easier to invest in them. And at the same time, we've got a lot of new players that are entering the industry. So we're going to dive into it in two parts. One part is going to be what's happening globally, and then the second part is going to be what's happening with all of these different trends and how are they impacting Asia. So let's dive in. So Deborah, the first question that we've got. So we've heard a lot about women in sports. Obviously, we just saw a really successful Women's World Cup, and we're seeing more and more interest in the sector. How do you see the developments taking place to be able to fund all these amazing developments and activities? And what's the trajectory of that?
Okay, thank you. I think women in sports we see this as one of the most exciting sectors of sports that are up and coming. Because if you think about it, this is what's going to come in the next 5 to 10 years. So from a scale perspective, just putting it in perspective, you look at the U.S. market, 20 million female sports fans, that's about a $10 billion market. That's 15% of the U.S. sports market. So there's a huge upside. And if you listened yesterday, I think you had Janet Hernandez from the World Cup spoke yesterday, said attendance at the Women's World Cup in Australia, 2x what it was in 2019 in Paris, and 33% above projections. It really is growing. So from a financing perspective, what you're starting to see, I think since when Colin was here last year, we've seen actually some really exciting developments. The NWSL, obviously, the Women's Soccer League, is getting a lot of attention. You have Sixth Street, just bought for an expansion franchise, $125 million. You have CVC's investment in the WTA. Raine is selling OL Raine, which is a Seattle-based NWSL team. It's an exciting time in the sector. I think, for financing to come, it really does rely on viewership. Right? You need to have the spectators, the viewers, the media follows that, the sponsorship follows that, the investment, and so forth. So we still are earlier days, if you look at kind of the numbers that we're talking about. But things like a Serena Williams, or more recently a Caitlin Clark. I don't know if anybody of you watched the NCAAs. These are big stars that are attracting a lot of viewers and therefore money into the sports. I think you're going to see some very interesting developments happen around that.
Well, very good. And so definitely a lot of room to grow and early days still, which is exciting. Okay, also another key theme that's been happening is definitely investment from the Middle East in sports. So you've had the Qataris just invested actually in North American sports leagues, both with the NHL and as well. They were in, what am I saying? They're also with the Washington Wizards. So both those and other teams there. So that was one. Saudis, of course, have continued to invest and just created a sports-specific fund as well. So where do you see that going? And what do you think are some of the key themes that are happening there in that type of investment?
So when we talked about like women's sports as up and coming and, the younger and earlier days in valuations, at the other end of the spectrum, you see where, a lot of the Middle East is coming in. And so if you look at some of the bigger teams that have been for sale and the prices paid on them, these are in a stratosphere that only a certain number of investors can really afford, and that is a lot coming out of Qatar, Saudi, or Abu Dhabi. as well as, frankly, the U.S. as well. I would say that those two kind of geographies are driving at the top end of valuations. So we clearly, are seeing, obviously, what they've spent on the F1, what they've spent on the World Cup, what they're spending in cricket. I think it's interesting. They are going both at, the top end with some of the major teams, leagues, and sports, but also kind of those that are up and coming. So cricket is an example. They are going to be prevalent. So why? I think one, obviously there is kind of the global soft power that comes. Sports is a truly global form of media, and so the investment there is a global branding for these nations. But I think perhaps equally, if not more importantly, is what it does, domestically. It's about building kind of health and wellness. It's diversification of your economy. Hopefully, it also drives some societal change in different areas. So I think that there's a lot of elements around why there's so much investment going to this area. But they are definitely here to stay and very prevalent in a lot of the things that we've been working on.
Yes, no question. Okay, and then, so one of the big things that everyone's been seeing, and this has really been going on for, I guess, a year and a half, kind of impacted by COVID, but obviously the sale of a lot of European football clubs. There's a lot for sale. Fair number are investing in from the US, but around the world. Obviously not always for top divisions, but sometimes further down. So take me through that a little bit more, and as well, this whole discussion around kind of multi-club structures, where you've got those, and are there synergies related to those, do you think?
Okay, I'll take the question in two parts. One, why are there so many European teams for sale right now? I mean, we sold Chelsea. As you may know, we're involved in the strategic alternatives for Manchester United. There have been a number of transactions that have happened or are happening in the market. One, I would say, if over the last 10 years you were an owner of a football team, it's something you could do, right? You could spend tens, 20s, 50s, hundreds of millions on the teams in terms of player trading. Now it's in the billions. So if you look at Man City versus Man U, you've got a five-fold minimum in terms of the spend that's happening at that level on player trading. You've changed the game a bit. So I think for the next 10 years, at least at the top end that you're talking about, the top end, you've got a different set of rules, right? It's at a much higher level in terms of where transactions are taking place and the amount of money that can be deployed. So if you were an owner for the last 10 years, not a bad time to exit. Take a few $100 million off the table and do something different with it and let a different group of people focus at the top end. That being said, to your other point on kind of multi-club ownership, that I think is an interesting trend as well. It's in one sense, it's coming new from kind of, I think in 2020 during COVID, a lot of the, in particular US, but also European leagues allowed private equity to start investing in these clubs. Because, listen, there's troubles, right? Without any games being able to be played, they needed capital to continue to fund. And so they allowed that to happen. So companies like Arctos, came into play at that time. But why are these multi-club franchises working? I'd say there's two categories they can fall in. One is in the same sport. So let's take City Football Group as an example of that. It's got Man City, but it also has franchises in New York, Australia, Japan, in China. I think they still have one. There, the synergy, this distinct synergy within the same sport is about hopefully players, right? Growing players throughout the system up to then the Man City or the top of the level. The other then is cross sport. So Fenway, as an example, right? They have football, they've got NASCAR, they've got a number of different platforms or teams there. That is, you can't really move the players around, but you can have learnings that you've taken from one sport to another. You can have broader sponsorship that you can do across the sports. So there's a number of areas, maybe deals that you can do in terms of media rights if you come with a package. I will say it is to be determined exactly what the synergies are going to be. This is still a work in progress. An argument could be made that it might be a greater synergy when you cross sports than necessarily being in a single sport. But this is still a work in progress. We're early days. Nonetheless, if you look at the players, these are 10 billion plus, players in the market right now. They're big.
I think it's interesting, too, when you look at some of the media trends and how media is distributed in different countries as well, from, let's say, North America and Europe. That's also interesting to see those synergies develop in that space. And I think we'll continue to see more. Okay, let's talk about athletes and celebrities getting into investment, because this has gone absolutely wild. There's lots. Obviously, you hear stories of like Ryan Reynolds and what he's done at Wrexham, but there's many, many more that are jumping in and contributing in different ways. So some of these are players that you look at Tom Brady saying that he's going to go and he's invested and then he's going to help out the team. You look at J.J. Watt with Burnley, and all these different players are getting into it. But it's not just at the pro level. It's also around sports tech companies. It's around health and well-being companies like Mark Wahlberg and F45, all these different things. Where do you see that going? And is this just the start of it, or is this just a quick trend that's happening?
Well, I think you can think about it in a few ways. I think the concept of just celebrity investment, it is certainly a part of what's happening. I wouldn't say it's driving the investments to date. It's arguably been to date more marketing than necessarily operational expertise being brought to bear. But that is starting to happen. And I think what's actually interesting, or another way of looking at it, is the different structures that are happening around it. So if you look at Messi and the recent deal that he did with Miami, but also with the MLS and Apple TV, what's interesting there is, okay, yeah, he's playing, but he took an equity stake in how the team's doing, but he's also taken an equity stake in, they've done a deal with MLS and Apple TV. And since he joined Miami, subscriptions for MLS on Apple TV have gone up by 290,000. I think that's what Tim Cook just announced. So he has driven, the sport, the development of the sport in the United States. He has, participated in that upside. That's a novel structure. So when you talk about like celebrity or athlete investment, or compensation as part of putting equity into bear, I think there's some interesting structures that are taking place. I think the other way to think about it is there are sports. Let's take cricket as an example. Maybe that's a younger sport, but how do you compensate some of the investors, some of the players? Either they already are big and perhaps that they can be investors themselves in some of these teams. Alternatively, maybe equity is a form of compensation for them. So I think as you talk about either the proactive investment by celebrities in, but also there are different structures that are taking place as well as compensation. There's a lot happening around athletes and kind of their equity or equitization of their participation in the sports teams. I think that's interesting.
Well, I think as well, look at what Messi's performance on the field has fueled it even more. So, I mean, that's exciting and great. And I think we're going to see more. Okay, let's turn to Asia. So, in many ways, we're really in the early stages of some of the areas of development of the sports industry in Asia. So, for example, you have massive eyeballs, but watching all these sports global and even domestically. But the challenge is the monetization of these sports and growing them out so they can be broader, bigger leagues, even stronger leagues. What's your take on that? And what can be done in that space? I see part of it is people just aren't paying a lot in media rights as one example, but I know there's other areas.
Well, I think there's two approaches. You can take the approach that the rest of the world does, and then you can recognize that this region of the world has differences. And arguably one of the biggest differences probably on the kind of availability of wealth to deploy towards entertainment. So let's take the first part. How do you take the more traditional approach, which is media rights, gate revenues, and merchandising around that? That is going to be around, I would say this is, something you and I have discussed in the past, is a lot of government officials or government incentives around infrastructure and building stadiums, building sports tourism, building, the competition and leagues and bringing people to that. That's going to start building more and more viewership, attendance, and that's arguably a little bit more traditional way, right, of building the sport. But you're right, today, I think for Man U, 70% of the fans are in this part of the world, but I'm going to make this number up, but it's like 5% of the revenues. Why is that? And it is because traditionally we haven't deployed money in the same way in these markets for media rights, ticket sales. We can't afford, the same types of ticket prices. So you have to think about it more from an Asian perspective. This is mobile first. Most of the economies in this part of the world, average age under 30. How do you appeal to this audience? It's not going to be in the same way. And so I think it's going to be social media. It's going to be gaming. Shorter form video. There's going to be, even OTT. If you think about it, I think sports as a percentage of OTT out here is like 40+%, and most of the Gen Zers, millennials, they're consuming on OTT, not on kind of some of the more traditional forms of media. So I think we do have to think differently in this part of the world. It is still a work in progress, but I expect you're going to see both paths happen. The more traditional approach, which is kind of the old forms of how leagues and teams, generated funds, and then the newer form, which I would say is, the mobile first, Gen Z gamification of things.
Yeah, and certainly one of the things we're working on is how do you actually kind of own the fan or connect even more closely with the fan? Because clearly it's great that it's on social media, but you don't necessarily own that data. So that's a key part. But I think you highlighted another really interesting development here is government-led investment, which we're seeing more and more of it. And as well, it could be even government and private sectors. So like what you're seeing in Hong Kong with Kai Tak Sports Park. You see private investments, so like the Mall Group in Thailand building out arenas and things of that nature. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. And then governments here, for in Singapore, the Sport SG taking over the Sports Hub. And so I think it could be a public and private relationship that will continue to grow. So let's then talk about really family offices and some of the conglomerates, because we're seeing a lot of movement there. Some of it is, of course, in the older days was family offices investing internationally in sports teams, and some still do, but we're seeing more investment locally, and that's going to continue to grow. Are you seeing any key trends in that area?
I will say we have, personally, we've seen much more still on the global scale in terms of the investment that's happened. And I think part of it is participation, in what they're seeing happen around the world in sports teams and leagues. But there's, and also the greater ability to participate. So you can participate, you can buy, right, as a whole, although today it's getting a little bit, as we talked about, a little bit challenging to buy an entire team. You can participate in a consortium, or you can participate in some of these funds, sports funds that are developing, because now the rules are opening that are allowing minority investment by private equity into sports. So I think there are more avenues to deploy, that it's not you being on the hook for the entire team and team development, but you can be a part of a club ownership. You can be part of a fund or a part of a consortium. That's one on the global basis. To your point on domestic, I think it's going to depend a little bit on market. We saw it for a while in China. A lot of private equity did go into the Chinese, football clubs. You are certainly seeing that happen now in India around cricket. It's got a very attractive economic structure, the sport there, and the team profitability, which is making it very interesting. You've seen CVC go in there. So I think there are by country, by sector, some interesting specific opportunities that are arising, yes.
And certainly more funding when it goes in some of these markets around sports tourism, pushing mass participation events, things like that, pushing more sports retail. You look at some of the investments have been, how do we build that out, which is great. Okay, last question. So you moved to Singapore a year ago, almost, around exactly a year ago, right around the F1, you had a big office opening. What are some of the things you've noticed in the region, and what has surprised you most about Southeast Asia?
I think, so everybody who's from Southeast Asia is going to find this as a rather ignorant remark, but we've always thought, okay, you have North Asia, you have China, you have India, you have Southeast Asia, and then you come down and you realize, okay, Southeast Asia is not one country, it is many. Everybody's, quite different. Even, the sectors that are of interest, the wealth levels, what's, driving Vietnam versus Indonesia versus, Thailand, Singapore. So I would say one, the perhaps overcoming that ignorance in terms of this region of the world. I think that sort of has been a surprise. I would say what's been interesting is, our thesis in opening an office here was very much that this part of the world has been and is on the right track to being the next, China. If you look at China over the last 10 years, irrespective of what you think about it today, it was on a phenomenal ride. And what was that on the back of? It was on the back of digitization, mobile first, a younger, population. You've got all of that in spades down here. And I think that excitement is sort of what brought us here. Second is the movement of capital. It is, not just about the capital that's in the region or the capital that's looking here from the west, but it's also coming down from the north and saying, this is the next region to come, and the excitement around that. So I think we have been, we've met an enormous number of phenomenal companies, sort of founders, some of whom are sitting in this room, as well as investors, and it's it's very exciting to kind of see what's next. And one of my partners who's sitting in front of me is heading the region, so we're very excited to have him on board. That was a new addition, and it's all great.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're just finishing. But I'd like to thank you very much for a great conversation. Obviously, we've just scratched the surface. There's lots more we can discuss, and please come and see us so we can certainly tell you more. And we'd love to continue this conversation. It's super critical to all that matters, and all that matters in sports matters to continue to discuss these issues, because they definitely impact us all. So that's great. Thanks again.
Thank you.